Hi guys, and welcome back to Star City Studios tutorials. My name's Jay Picasso, and today we're going to look at how to fatten up your bottom end, trying to get the most out of your kick drum and bass. Now, what most of you should be aware of is that your kick drum and your bass actually make up 50% of the mix. Now, bearing in mind that my track in front of me doesn't even have vocals on it, and most will, that's quite a lot of your mix. So we need to know how to treat that to kind of make it fatter and to make it stand out. So in this tutorial today, we're going to be looking at those elements and how to get the most out of them. I'm just going to play back the track so you guys can have a quick listen to what I'm working with. So, and it loops on again. So I just kind of threw this together for the sake of this tutorial. Obviously, most tracks have a few more elements than this going on, but again, given that 50% of that mix is going to be handed over to the kick and the bass, I figured that this is just a nice place for us to start. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the kick drum. Let's just solo that and bring on the click track for some context. So the first thing that we're going to do to treat this kick drum is open up the EQ. And I'm going to use the standard Logic one for the time being and use the analyzer to just show you exactly what the kick drum wave is doing. So the bulk of the kick drum obviously is coming through between 40 and I'd say roughly about 100 hertz. But the secret here is to start boosting around 280. Now, before I touch the 80 hertz, what I need to do is I need to compensate for that boost. And everything that's happening below 40 hertz is not really relevant to most playback devices. So what that means is that we can get rid of most of the frequency that's happening below 40. And we're going to do that by using a low cut filter, which starts at 37 hertz. And I'm just going to move that roughly to about 40. And then I'm going to straighten it up so it starts to just cut deeper with that 40 hertz range. Everything below 40 in this sense is being removed from this mix at this point in time, or this particular kick drum. That now means I can boost around 80 without adding too much information that isn't actually relevant to our mix. So I'm going to play back the kick drum and I'm going to start to boost around 80 hertz. And you're going to hear how it starts to fatten up the bottom end. Now, if I do that excessively, just so it makes a huge difference to the mix, again, let's just try and keep it on 80. Now, depending on what you're listening back to this on, I mean, I would suggest have some headphones, if not on some studio monitors. Of course, you'll start to hear how that really starts to add weight now to the bottom end of this drum. I would actually argue that that's a little bit too much, so we need to kind of bring that back a little bit. We can also add a bit more punch to the kick drum around the 200 hertz mark. So we'll start to do that in just a moment. Okay, cool. So that's about right. Let's start to add to this 200 hertz and see what that does. So I'm just going to turn off the click and then I'm going to just reference this on and off so we can start to hear what that's done. So that's with it off and back on. Nice and chunky. All right, cool. So that's that. Let's now move on to the bass. So same thing applies with the bass. What we're going to do first is we're going to open up a new EQ. And again, given that it's low end information, we're going to assume the same about the bass as we did with the kick drum to start. Okay, so with cutting, you can certainly cut frequencies in the same place. But what I would suggest is to get the best out of your mix when it comes to boosting frequencies. We want to kind of look a bit more in detail so we're not boosting things in the exact same place, because that essentially will create mud. And what we're trying to avoid whilst fattening our bass and our kick is the mud zone. The mud zone, of course, course, is the stuff that's just muffly and doesn't really add much value to your track. So we're trying to avoid that as best possible, while simultaneously, of course, fattening up the lower end. So let's go ahead and use the low cut again, and let's bring this to 40, and of course hear what this does as I do it. Now, what's interesting about that, of course, is that for most humans, we don't actually hear lower than 20 hertz, hence why it's not represented on here. And again, this sort of zone here now is to do with someone's age and someone's their ear health, if you like. So very few people actually take in information that's lower than 40 hertz anyway. Most systems that play music back don't really add too much under 40 hertz because it's a wasted frequency as far as what we hear is concerned. As far as what we feel, of course, is concerned, and the vibrations, etc., it's quite important, but it's not something that we're trying to add into our music at this point in time. So that being said, let's now start to boost around the 200 mark here to see what that does. Now, as I said to you before, when it comes to boosting frequencies, we don't want to do that too much in the same area. So what I'm going to do, just for comparison's sake, is I'm going to turn on the kick drum, and I'm also going to bring up the kick drum's EQ so we can just see side by side what they're doing. So we can see a slightly lower boost in the 200 hertz on the kick drum. And what we're going to do here is we're going to have a slightly higher boost on the 200 hertz on the bass. However, what we're going to do is we're going to make it narrower. So it's not going to be boosting all those frequencies around it as much as the kick drum would at this point in time. Now again, we do want to add to 80 because again, it's a low end instrument, and this is really, the 80 hertz is really where the fatness comes from. However, of course, we don't want to boost too much, and ideally, much like the 200 hertz that we've done here, we want to make it much more narrower. So I'm going to do this in real time so you guys can hear how this affects our bass. Okay, so that has now added the fatness that we were looking for. When we play this back with our track, let's add the hats back in. Okay, cool. So the last thing that we're going to do here, just to make this bass work a bit better with the kick and the rest of the mix, is we're going to compress it. So we're going to use, again, a standard Logic compressor for the time being. And there's only really a couple of things to kind of take note of. What I would suggest, Logic does have some cool presets, and there's nothing wrong with using presets, but what I would suggest is that, of course, every mix needs to be treated slightly differently. So there's nothing wrong with starting from a preset and then kind of making your way from there, but I would say that you need to customize most of the settings in order to get the most out of the instrument that you're trying to affect. So let's just add a light bass compressor to the bass line, and let's see what that has done. And we'll just run our A/B test on and off. So it's not doing much at the moment, but of course that's kind of the point of a compressor. We don't want it to do too much unless, of course, the bass is absolutely out of control. And in this instance, it's not. However, there are a couple of things that we'll look at just to kind of make sure that we're getting the most out of this compressor unit, okay? The first thing, of course, is the threshold. Now, the threshold is important because it really, simply put, it allows you to set the point at which the compressor starts compressing your audio signal. That essentially means it's a volume-based effect. So the louder the volume, the more it's going to start compressing that volume, if that makes sense. So let's just adjust this threshold a little bit just to make sure we're getting the best signal. So I've lowered the threshold slightly, meaning that the compressor is now affecting the bass a lot sooner than it was before. The higher the threshold, of course, it means that there needs to be more volume in order for the compressor to actually start working. So I've lowered it because, of course, bass is a loud signal and it's a really, really dense signal. So it's good to have a relatively low threshold on your compressor whenever adding it to a bass. Okay, cool. So that sounds all right. The second thing that we're going to look at, and this is the last thing that we're going to look at on this, is really the attack. So as you should know, the attack simply means how quickly the effect attacks the bass. And of course, the release essentially means how quickly it releases that effect. So the quicker the attack time, the sooner the effect is going to take place, and the quicker, or the longer rather, the release time, the longer the effect is going to hold for. So if we quicken the release time, it will happen and then it will release it quicker. Of course, depending on the instrument or the vocal, you'll make edits accordingly. So what we're going to do here is just adjust the attack time slightly so we can hear it kicking in slightly sooner. Now, the reason why I wanted to do that is because essentially what's happening is it's lowering the volume of the bass line according to how the compressor's working. What that means is now I can turn up the bass line in the mix without it spilling over into the mix too much. Now, if I add the kick drum back, cool, here we go. And that's a wrap, guys. Hope that helps. Take care. See you soon.